Arthur and Eleanor saw the end of their lives, not in a flash of light, but in the slow, grinding machinery of someone else's ambition. For 76 years, they had built a world on a quiet street, a fortress of brick and memory. Now, that fortress was a line item on a spreadsheet, and they were the collateral damage. They ended up in a place that smelled of rust and finality, a defunct slaughterhouse on the edge of the county, a place sold for the price of a cheap cup of coffee. They bought it for $5. A year later, a line of cars stretched down the gravel road, people waiting, hoping for a space inside the one place society had thrown away, the one place that had become a sanctuary. But that was the end of the story. The beginning was much quieter and far more cruel. The house on Maple Street was more Arthur than Arthur was. He had laid the foundation with his father in 1968, a young man with strong hands and a future as clear as a pane of new glass. He had framed every wall, run every inch of copper pipe, and wired every outlet. When the city inspector came, a gruff man named Henderson Sr., he had walked the site, grunted, and signed the permit with a single, decisive flourish. "Good work, son," he'd said. "This'll stand longer than both of us." Arthur had taken that as the highest praise. Eleanor had made it a home. She chose the pale yellow for the kitchen walls, the color of morning sunlight. She planted the rose bushes that now climbed the trellis by the porch, their thorns thick as a man's thumb. Inside, the shelves bowed under the weight of books she had curated over a lifetime as a town librarian, each spine a memory, each page a quiet friend. Their son, Mark, had grown up within those walls, his height marked in pencil on a doorframe in the pantry, a ladder of faint lines ascending toward a future they thought they were all building together. They had lived a life of quiet competence. Arthur could fix anything that whirred, clicked, or leaked. Eleanor could find any piece of information, organize any chaos into neat, alphabetized order. They paid their taxes on time. They were good neighbors. They saved what they could, not for extravagance, but for the predictable uncertainties of age, a new roof, a failing furnace, the quiet dignity of not being a burden. Mark had been their single greatest project and their most confounding. He was a man of his time, which meant he was a man in a hurry. He spoke in terms of assets and leverage, of scaling and optimization. He lived in the city 2 hours and a world away, in a glass tower where the windows didn't open. He called every Sunday, a conversation so structured it felt like a business meeting. "How's the portfolio?" he'd ask, not "how are you?" When Eleanor had her health scare the previous year, a brief but terrifying bout with pneumonia, Mark had insisted they sign a durable power of attorney. "It's just a formality," he'd said, his voice smooth and reassuring over the phone. "In case something happens, and I need to manage your affairs, pay the bills, you know. It's the responsible thing to do." They trusted him. He was their son. The lawyer he'd sent over was young and efficient. The paperwork a blur of legalese they'd signed on their kitchen table, the same table where they had helped Mark with his homework decades ago. It felt like a responsible act, a prudent step in the winding down of things. It felt safe. The vacation was Mark's idea, too. A surprise for their 50th wedding anniversary. An all-expenses-paid trip to a quiet seaside town in Florida. "You deserve it," he'd insisted. "Get away from the cold. A whole month. Just relax." They were hesitant. They didn't like to be away from home for so long. But Mark was insistent, and it was easier to agree than to argue. He booked the flights, the condo, everything. He drove them to the airport himself, a rare visit. He hugged them tightly. "Have a wonderful time," he said. "Don't worry about a thing." The first week was pleasant. The sun was warm, the ocean a soothing, constant rhythm. But a quiet unease began to settle in. A real estate agent called Eleanor's cell phone by mistake, asking about showing times. Eleanor was confused. "I think you have the wrong number," she said. A few days later, a neighbor from Maple Street called. "Art, I saw a big moving truck in your driveway. Everything okay?" Arthur's blood went cold. He called Mark. The phone went straight to voicemail. He called again and again. For 3 days, every call was met with the same sterile, recorded voice. They flew home early, a sick feeling churning in their stomachs. They took a taxi from the airport. As the car turned onto Maple Street, Eleanor gripped Arthur's arm. The house was still there, but it was wrong. The rose bushes were trampled. A large, garish sold sign was staked into the front lawn, a red gash against the familiar green. The front door had a lockbox on it. The key did not work. Arthur, his hands shaking with a rage so profound it felt like grief, kicked the door. He kicked it again and again until his leg ached, the solid wood he had hung himself barely shuddering. It was a good door. He had built it to last. Mark finally answered his phone that evening. They were sitting in a sterile motel room a few towns over, the only place they could afford. The air smelled of disinfectant and despair. Mark's voice was calm, measured, as if he were explaining a quarterly report. It was the best move for everyone, he said. The house was becoming a money pit, an asset that wasn't performing. I got a great price. The money isn't an account for you. It's enough to get you into a very nice assisted living facility. Oak Meadows. It has a golf course. Eleanor took the phone. You sold our home. Her voice was quiet, a whisper of disbelief. I liquidated an asset. Mark corrected her. I've secured your future. You don't have to worry about upkeep anymore. No more shoveling snow. No more leaky faucets. Arthur fixed the faucets. Eleanor said, her voice trembling. That was his home. You sold his work. You sold my garden. You sold our life. I'm sorry you're being emotional about this, Mark said, a slight edge of impatience in his tone. This is a practical solution. I'll send you the brochure for Oak Meadows. You'll love it. Then he hung up. They sat in the silence of the motel room. The patterned bedspread was thin and rough. The television bolted to the wall was dark. The money Mark had mentioned was a fraction of the home's true value, just enough to be an insult, a severance package for a lifetime of parenting. Not nearly enough to buy another home, but just enough, as he'd said, for a deposit on a room in a place where you went to wait for the end. They went to the police. The officer was young, sympathetic, but ultimately useless. He had power of attorney, the officer said, flipping through their paperwork. It looks legal. This is a civil matter. You'll have to sue him, sue their own son. The words were meaningless. They didn't have money for a lawsuit. They had the clothes in their suitcases and a dwindling bank account. They were 76 years old, and they were homeless. The days in the motel bled into one another. Each morning, Arthur would wake up early, his hands flexing, needing something to build, to fix. But there was nothing. He would walk to the gas station for coffee, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. Eleanor spent her days at the small public library in town. It was the only place that felt familiar. She sat at a computer, the fluorescent lights humming above her, and she began to do the only thing she knew how to do. She began to research. She searched for housing, for senior assistance programs, for legal aid. Every path was a dead end, a maze of forms and waiting lists and qualifications they didn't meet. They had too much money from the sale to be considered destitute, but not enough to be solvent. They were trapped in the gray, bureaucratic purgatory of the system. They were invisible. The money was running out. The motel bill ate into it every day. Despair was a physical weight pressing down on them. Arthur stopped talking much. He would just sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. Eleanor felt a cold, creeping fear that he was giving up, that the engine inside him was sputtering out. One night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in the dark, the glow of the laptop the only light, and she expanded her search. She moved from rental listings to real estate, from habitable homes to raw land. She typed in search terms born of desperation, as is condemned, tax auction. She was looking for a foothold, any small crack in the world they could cling to. And then she found it. It was a county tax lien auction listing, a forgotten property, seized for decades of unpaid taxes. The description was stark. Parcel 7B4, 5 acres, zoned industrial/agricultural. Structure on property condemned. No utilities. Sold as is, whereas the minimum bid was the total of the back taxes and fees. For $1.87. There was a single, grainy photograph. It showed a hulking, concrete building, windowless and grim, surrounded by overgrown fields. The title on the listing read, Former Black Creek Abattoir. A slaughterhouse. She stared at the screen, a strange idea taking root in the barren soil of her mind. A condemned slaughterhouse. A place of death. A place no one wanted. A place that cost less than a gallon of milk. She clicked through the county records, her librarian skills kicking into high gear. She found the original construction blueprints from 1952. Poured concrete walls, a steel roof truss system. It was built like a bunker. She found the last inspection report from 1988, just before it was shut down. The inspector had noted foundation and core structure remained sound despite cosmetic decay. She woke Arthur. He blinked at the harsh light of the laptop screen. "Look," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stared at the picture. "Ellie, that's a slaughterhouse. It's a ruin. The foundation is sound," she said. "It has poured concrete walls. A steel roof. It's still standing, Arthur. It's condemned." "We are condemned," she replied, the words hanging in the stale air between them. "We are sitting in this room, waiting to run out of money. We can go to Mark's, Oak Meadows, and wait to die. Or we can do this. It's $5, Arthur. For $5, we can own something again. We can have a place to stand." He looked at her, at the fierce, desperate light in her eyes. He saw the woman he had married, the quiet librarian with a spine of steel. He saw the flicker of a fight he thought had been extinguished. He looked back at the screen, at the ugly concrete box, a monument to forgotten industry. It was an insane idea. It was a terrifying idea. It was the only idea they had. "Okay, Ellie," he said, his voice raspy. "Okay." The next day, they drove their old sedan to the county courthouse. The auction was held in a stuffy, wood-paneled room. They were the only ones there for Parcel 7B4. The auctioneer called the number. Eleanor raised her hand. $5, she said, her voice clear and steady. The auctioneer banged his gavel. "Sold." They paid in cash and walked out with a deed to 5 acres of weeds and a concrete tomb. The drive out to the property was silent. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to a deeply rutted dirt track. The car bottomed out twice. When they finally broke through a line of overgrown sumac trees, they saw it. The photograph hadn't done it justice. It was immense, a gray block of a building squatting in a field of thorns and wild grasses. The metal doors were rusted shut, scarred with graffiti. The air hung heavy and still, thick with the ghosts of what had happened there. Arthur got out of the car. He walked the perimeter. He pulled at the rusted doors, but they wouldn't budge. He found a place where the concrete wall had crumbled slightly near the foundation and peered into the darkness. The smell that wafted out was thick, a cloying mix of rust, decay, and something ancient and metallic, like old blood soaked into the very bones of the place. "Ellie, we can't," he said, turning back to the car. This is a tomb." Eleanor got out and stood beside him. She looked at the building not with his practical eyes, but with her own. She saw the solid lines. She saw the way it had resisted decades of neglect. She saw a roof that wasn't leaking. "It's a fortress, Arthur," she said. "No one can take this from us. We just have to get inside." It took him the rest of the day. He used the tire iron from the trunk, a rock, and sheer, stubborn will. He worked on the hinges of a smaller side door, chipping away at the rust, leveraging the metal with grunts of exertion. The sun beat down on his back. Sweat soaked his shirt. Eleanor sat in the car, watching, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and a fierce, burgeoning hope. Finally, with a screech of tortured metal, the door gave way, opening a few inches. He squeezed through the gap. The darkness inside was absolute. The air was cold and stagnant. He fumbled for the small flashlight on his keychain. The weak beam cut through the gloom, revealing a vast, cavernous space. The floor was concrete, stained dark in patches, sloping gently toward a series of drains in the center. Heavy steel hooks hung from tracks on the ceiling, silent and menacing. Chains lay coiled in corners like sleeping metal snakes. It smelled of death. But Arthur, the builder, saw something else. He saw the massive steel I-beams supporting the roof. He saw the block walls, thick and solid. He saw the concrete floor, cracked but unbroken. He ran his hand along the wall. It was cold, damp, but it was solid. He stomped his foot on the floor. No give. Henderson Sr.'s words echoed in his mind. This'll stand longer than both of us. He came back out into the sunlight, blinking. He was covered in cobwebs and grime. He looked at Eleanor. The bones are good, he said, and for the first time in weeks, a flicker of the old Arthur, the competent, confident man, was in his eyes. The bones are good. Their first night was spent in the car. It was uncomfortable and cold, but it was different from the motel. They were sleeping on their own land. The next day, the work began. It was not a grand act of construction, but a campaign of 1,000 small, grueling battles. The first battle was against the filth. They propped the door open to let in air and light. Eleanor, armed with a bucket, a stiff brush, and a gallon of bleach they'd bought with their dwindling cash, started on a small section of the floor near the entrance. She scrubbed for hours, her back screaming in protest. The grime was layered, a geological record of the building's brutal history. But slowly, painstakingly, a patch of clean, gray concrete emerged. It was a tiny victory, an island of order in an ocean of decay. Arthur's first priority was water. The property records showed an old well on the site. He found it under a tangle of thorny vines, its concrete cap cracked. He spent 2 days clearing the area, then another prying off the cap. He lowered a bucket on a rope. It came up with murky, stagnant water. He knew the well was deep, the water table pure, but the well itself had been contaminated by years of neglect. He needed to flush it, to shock it with chlorine, to get the old pump working. He needed parts. That led him to Gus's Hardware, an old-fashioned store in the nearest town, a place that smelled of sawdust and machine oil. The shelves were piled high, with everything from carriage bolts to canning jars. Gus, the owner, was a man of Arthur's generation, with hands as calloused as his own. Arthur brought the corroded foot valve from the old well pumped to the counter. "Can't get these anymore," Gus said, turning it over in his hands. "They built these to last. Not like the plastic junk they sell now." He looked at Arthur. "What's the project?" Arthur was hesitant to share their story. He felt a deep sense of shame about their situation. "Just trying to get an old well working," he said vaguely. Gus looked at the grime under Arthur's fingernails, the exhaustion in his eyes. He recognized the look of a man fighting a losing battle. "Where you out at?" "The old Slaughterhouse," Arthur mumbled. Gus raised an eyebrow. He whistled softly. "That place. Heard the county sold it. Didn't think anyone was crazy enough to buy it." He looked at Arthur again, a long, appraising look. "You're not crazy," he said finally. "You're desperate." He went into the back of the store and returned with a heavy, brass foot valve, still in its original wax paper packaging from 40 years ago. "Found this cleaning out my dad's old stock. It's yours." "How much?" Arthur asked, reaching for his wallet. "Tell you what," Gus said, leaning on the counter. "You're a tradesman. I can see it in your hands. I'll open a line of credit for you. Get what you need. Pay me when you can. A man working that hard on a place like that deserves a little faith." Arthur was speechless. It was the first act of kindness, of trust, they had received since their world had fallen apart. He felt a lump form in his throat. He just nodded, unable to speak. He took the valve and the other fittings Gus recommended. That day, he got the well working. The water that eventually pumped out was cold, clear, and sweet. It was the best water he had ever tasted. It tasted like hope. They designated a corner of the vast main room as their living space. Arthur framed a small room within the larger space, using salvaged lumber he found in a collapsed shed on the property. It wasn't insulated, it wasn't pretty, but it was a defined space. It was a room. They bought a small propane heater that rattled and hissed, but kept the damp chill at bay. They slept on an air mattress, their clothes stored in plastic tubs. It was primitive, but it was theirs. Eleanor continued her work of reclaiming the space. She scrubbed floors until her hands were raw. She discovered that the high-pressure hoses the workers had used to clean the kill floor were still coiled on the walls. Arthur got the water pump connected to them, and suddenly they had a powerful tool in their fight against the filth. They spent days spraying down the concrete walls, washing away decades of grime, revealing the clean, solid structure beneath. The building began to feel less like a tomb and more like a cavern, a shelter. Slowly, a routine formed. Arthur worked on the building, patching the roof with tar, replacing the few broken window panes in a small office section with plexiglass. Eleanor managed their meager resources, kept their small living space clean, and started researching a new problem: electricity. They were living on propane and battery-powered lanterns. To make the place truly habitable, they needed power. One afternoon, a battered pickup truck rumbled down their lane. A young woman, barely out of her teens, got out. She was visibly pregnant, her face pale and bruised. She clutched a worn backpack to her chest. "Are you the people?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The ones living out here?" Eleanor approached her cautiously. "We are. Can we help you?" "My name is Maya," the girl said, tears welling in her eyes. "I heard. At the church. They said you were fixing this place up. I have nowhere to go. He kicked me out. I can work. I can clean. I can cook. I just need a place to be safe." Eleanor looked at this girl, this child, and saw a reflection of her own desperation. She saw another person discarded by the world. She looked at Arthur. He had a hammer in his hand, his expression unreadable. He looked at Maya, then at the vast, empty, but clean space behind them. He gave a single, curt nod. "Come inside," Eleanor said, putting an arm around Maya's trembling shoulders. "You're safe here." Maya's arrival changed the dynamic. She was a whirlwind of nervous energy at first, but as the days passed, she settled. She took over the cleaning with a quiet efficiency that amazed Eleanor. She was a good cook, able to make a hearty meal from simple ingredients. Her presence filled a small part of the cavernous silence. She was the first citizen of their strange, new country. A few weeks later, another arrived. A young man named Leo, kicked out of his home by his parents for being gay. He was angry, defiant, but homeless. Arthur, who had never known anyone openly gay in his life, was gruff with him at first, but he saw the boy was a hard worker. He put a shovel in his hands and set him to work clearing the overgrown fields. Leo worked without complaint, his anger fueling his efforts. Slowly, a grudging respect grew between the old man and the young one. Arthur began teaching him how to measure, how to cut, how to frame a wall. He was passing on his skills, something he had thought he would never do again. Then came Beatrice, a widow in her late 60s who had lost her home to a reverse mortgage after her husband's medical bills bankrupted them. She was a master gardener. She looked at the acres of neglected land that had been soaked in the waste of the slaughterhouse, and she saw a challenge. "The soil is poisoned," she declared. "We'll have to build raised beds." And so they did. Arthur and Leo built long, waist-high wooden boxes. Gus for the hardware store arranged for a local landscaping company to donate truckloads of clean topsoil and compost. Beatrice, with Maya's help, began to plant seeds. A garden began to grow in a place of death. They were a strange, cobbled-together family. An old plumber, an old librarian, a pregnant teenager, an angry gay kid, and a bankrupt widow. They were the wreckage of the modern world, washed up on the shore of this concrete island. But they were building something. In the evenings, they would eat together at a long trestle table Arthur had built. The vast room would be filled with the sound of conversation, the clatter of forks, the hiss of the propane heater. It was a home. Arthur, with Leo's help, had managed to get a generator working, powering a few lights and a small refrigerator. He had plumbed a simple but functional bathroom and kitchen, his work as meticulous as ever. The place was still rough, still a work in progress, but it was functional. It was clean. It was safe. The outside world, however, was not content to leave them alone. Their quiet rebellion had been noticed. One morning, a crisp white county vehicle pulled up. A man in a polo shirt with a government logo embroidered on it got out, a clipboard in his hand. He was young, his face a mask of bureaucratic neutrality. "Code enforcement," he announced. "We've had a complaint." The complaint was anonymous, of course, but Eleanor knew in her bones it had come from Mark. He would see their survival as an indictment of his decision, an embarrassment. The inspector's name was Henderson. He was the grandson of the man who had approved Arthur's house 50 years ago. But he had none of his grandfather's pragmatism. He saw only violations. He walked through the building, his pen scratching furiously on his clipboard. Illegal habitation of a condemned structure. Improper zoning use. Lack of certified electrical system. Unpermitted plumbing. The list went on. He finally stopped and faced them, his expression severe. "This is a dangerous and illegal setup," he said. "I'm posting a notice of condemnation. You have 60 days to bring this entire structure up to full commercial and residential code, or we will demolish it at your expense." 60 days. It was an impossible deadline. To bring a 50,000 square foot industrial building up to code would take millions of dollars and a team of contractors. It was a death sentence for their new life. Despair, which had been held at bay for months, came flooding back. That night, no one spoke at dinner. The food sat untouched. Maya was crying softly. Leo stared at his plate, his jaw tight with anger. Beatrice's hands trembled. Arthur sat like a statue, his face grim. It was Eleanor who spoke first. "He is just a man with a clipboard," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We are not illegal. We are a family. This is our home. We will not let him take it." "But how, Ellie?" Arthur asked, his voice rough with defeat. "It's impossible. The code, the permits, the money. We have something more important than money," she said, looking around the table at their found family. "We have us." The next morning, Eleanor went to the library. She didn't look for loopholes. She looked for the code itself. She downloaded the entire county building code, hundreds of pages of dense, technical language. She began to read, to highlight, to cross-reference. She would fight them with their own rules. Arthur, meanwhile, went to see Gus. He laid out the situation. Gus listened, his brow furrowed. "That Henderson kid," he grumbled. "All book, no sense. His grandfather would be ashamed." He picked up the phone. "Earl," he said into the receiver. "It's Gus. I need a favor. You still got your master electrician's license active?" He made another call. "Frank? How's that hip? Listen, I got a plumbing job for you. Pro bono. Yeah, it's a big 1-inch. Word spread through the network of old tradesmen, the semi-retired, the ones who felt like Arthur and Eleanor, that the world had moved on without them. They started showing up at the Slaughterhouse. Earl, a retired electrician with hands gnarled by arthritis but a mind as sharp as a new bit. Frank, a master plumber who walked with a cane but could still sweat a copper joint better than any man half his age. A dozen others. They came with their own tools, with a lifetime of knowledge. They saw what Arthur was doing, the quality of his work, and they were impressed. They saw the small community that had formed, and they understood. It became a cause. They weren't just saving a building. They were making a stand. The Slaughterhouse was transformed into a massive, coordinated work site. Earl and his crew began running conduit, pulling wire, setting up a proper breaker system. Frank inspected Arthur's plumbing, made a few suggestions, and then declared it damn near perfect. He helped Arthur draw up the schematics needed for the permit application. Carpenters helped Leo frame out more rooms, properly this time, with fire stops and correct spacing. Eleanor became the project manager. With her library of code books, she was the ultimate authority. "The code requires a 2-hour fire-rated wall here," she would say, pointing to a blueprint. "We need GFI outlets within 6 feet of any water source." She was relentless, meticulous. The tradesmen, who at first were skeptical of taking orders from a librarian, quickly came to respect her encyclopedic knowledge. The 60-day deadline loomed. They worked from sunup to sundown. The community in town rallied. The church organized a food drive, bringing hot meals to the worksite every day. Other businesses donated materials. The story of the Slaughterhouse Saints, as one person called them, was spreading. It was a story people wanted to believe in. In the middle of this frantic activity, a sleek, black sedan pulled up. Mark got out. He was wearing an expensive suit, and he looked profoundly out of place. He stared at the bustling worksite, at the dozens of people working, laughing, sharing coffee. His face was a mask of cold fury. He found Arthur and Eleanor near the new kitchen area. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low and seething. "What is this circus? I saw it on the local news. You are embarrassing me. You're supposed to be in a retirement home, not squatting in an abattoir with a bunch of vagrants." Arthur took a step toward him, his hands clenched into fists. But Eleanor put a hand on his arm. She faced her son. Her expression was not angry, not hurt, just weary. "We build a home, Mark," she said simply. "This is not a home," he sputtered. "It's a slaughterhouse. It's disgusting. It's a health hazard. You taught us the difference," Eleanor said, her voice still quiet, but each word landing like a hammer blow. "A home is a place where people care for each other. A house is an asset you sell when it's no longer performing. You sold the house. We kept the home." Mark stared at her, speechless. He looked at his father, who was looking at him with an expression of pure, cold pity. He saw Maya walk by, her belly round and full, and she smiled at Eleanor. He saw Leo on a ladder, laughing with an old carpenter. He saw that he was the stranger here. He had no place in the world his parents had built from the ruins of the one he had destroyed. He turned without another word, got in his car, and drove away. He never came back. The day of the final inspection arrived. The 60 days were up. Henderson returned, his face impassive. He was accompanied by the chief building inspector and a fire marshal. The work stopped. A silence fell over the huge building. Everyone stood back, watching, their hopes hanging on this one man's decision. Henderson started his inspection. He was meticulous, checking every detail. He ran a voltmeter on the outlets. He checked the water pressure. He examined the fire-rated drywall, the emergency lighting, the ventilation systems. He spent 4 hours going through every inch of the renovated space. Arthur, Earl, and Frank followed him, answering his technical questions in quiet, professional tones. Finally, Henderson stood in the center of the main hall, which was now a bright, clean community space with a dining area and a lounge. He looked at the new, insulated rooms lining the walls. He looked at the commercial-grade kitchen, gleaming with stainless steel. He looked at the schematics Eleanor had prepared, which were as detailed and professional as any architectural firm's. He lowered his clipboard. He looked at Arthur and Eleanor. "When I came here 60 days ago," he said, his voice quiet, "I saw a derelict building being used as an illegal squat. I was right to condemn it." He paused, and every heart in the room stopped. "But this," he said, gesturing to the space around them, "this is not the same building. The work is exemplary. The plumbing is flawless. The electrical is better than most new constructions I see. You haven't just met the code. You've exceeded it." He looked around at the assembled community, at Maya and Leo and Beatrice, at the old tradesmen standing with their arms crossed, their faces proud. "This isn't a slaughterhouse anymore," Henderson said, a note of awe in his voice. I don't know what this is, but it's built to last. And it's safe." He took out his pen, and with a decisive flourish that reminded Arthur of his grandfather, he signed the certificate of occupancy. "Congratulations," he said. "Welcome home." A cheer erupted in the vast space, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. People were hugging, crying. Arthur wrapped his arms around Eleanor and held her tight, burying his face in her hair. They had done it. They had fought the system, and they had won. The local news story about the final inspection was picked up by a state paper, then by a national news wire. The story of the elderly couple who had been kicked out by their son and had turned a condemned slaughterhouse into a haven for the homeless went viral. Letters and small donations began to pour in from all over the country. An architect from Chicago volunteered to help them design a plan to convert the rest of the massive building into proper apartments and workshops. A lawyer helped them set up a nonprofit foundation to manage the property and the donations, ensuring its future. The place, which they now called the foundation, grew. They built small, simple cabins on the property for more people in need. Leo, now a skilled carpenter, supervised the construction. Maya had her baby, a healthy girl named Hope, who was doted on by a dozen surrogate grandparents. Beatrice's gardens expanded, producing enough vegetables to feed everyone, with extra to sell at the local farmers market. The slaughterhouse had become a place of life, a self-sustaining ecosystem of care and second chances. One afternoon, a car pulled up that was neither a beat-up work truck nor a visitor in need. A woman got out. It was Laura, Mark's wife. She looked older, tired. She approached Eleanor, who was sitting on the new front porch, shelling peas with Beatrice. I came to apologize, Laura said, her voice choked with emotion. Walmart did what I let him do. It was wrong. I think about it every day. She held out an envelope. It's not much, but Eleanor looked at the envelope, then at Laura's face. She saw genuine remorse there. We don't need your money, Laura, she said, her voice gentle. I know, Laura whispered, tears streaming down her face. He lost his job after the story came out. We're losing our house. It's karma, I guess. Eleanor looked out at the fields, where Leo was teaching a new young man how to build a fence. She looked at the main building, where the sound of children's laughter echoed from the new daycare room. She thought of her son, a man so obsessed with assets that he had lost everything of value. She felt a pang of sadness, not for herself, but for him. She turned back to Laura. The door is open, Laura, she said. If you need help, if you need a place to stand. The door is always open, Laura just sobbed, a sound of grief and gratitude. The seasons turned. The first snows of winter dusted the fields. The foundation was warm and bright against the cold landscape. Arthur had installed a large porch light by the main entrance, a beacon that stayed on all night. One evening, he and Eleanor sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot tea. The air was cold and crisp. The stars were brilliant in the dark country sky. Inside, they could hear the low murmur of conversation, the sound of their family. They looked out at the world they had built, this impossible, beautiful thing born from betrayal and despair. Arthur reached over and took Eleanor's hand. His palm was rough, calloused, the hand of a man who had spent his life building things. She interlaced her fingers with his. He was right about one thing, Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. What's that? Eleanor asked. This'll stand longer than both of us, he said, nodding toward the building. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. They hadn't gotten their old life back. They had built a new one, a better one. It wasn't a life of quiet comfort, but one of purpose. They were no longer invisible. They were the architects of a sanctuary, the keepers of a refuge. The porch light cast a warm, golden glow across the snow-covered ground, a steady, unwavering promise in the vast darkness. The light stayed on,